Before the world changed forever, there was a moment of silence, a moment when nations stood strong, empires ruled vast lands, and people believed the future would bring peace and progress. But beneath that calm surface, something was quietly building: tension, rivalry, and a growing sense of uncertainty. No one knew it yet, but the world was standing on the edge of one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. A war that would stretch across continents, a war that would change borders, destroy empires, and reshape the future of the modern world. This was not just a war of armies, it was a war of ideas, of power, of survival. From the crowded streets of Europe to the muddy trenches of the Western Front, millions of lives would be caught in a conflict unlike anything the world had ever seen. And it all began with a single moment, a single decision, a single spark. This is the story of World War I. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to a time when the world still believed that war on this scale was impossible. A world on the edge. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe appeared peaceful on the surface. Powerful empires ruled vast territories. Cities were growing. Technology was advancing, and many believed the world was entering a modern age of progress. But beneath this calm surface, tension was building. Rivalries between nations were growing stronger, alliances were forming, and a single spark was all it would take to ignite a global conflict. The major powers of Europe. Before the war began, Europe was dominated by a few powerful nations: the British Empire, controlling lands across the world; France, still recovering from past conflicts; Germany, a rapidly rising industrial and military power; Austria-Hungary, a vast but unstable empire; and Russia, with one of the largest armies in the world. These nations were not just neighbors, they were competitors, watching each other closely. The alliance system. To protect themselves, countries began forming alliances. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy formed the Triple Alliance. Meanwhile, France, Russia, and Britain formed the Triple Entente. These alliances were meant to prevent war, but in reality, they made any conflict far more dangerous, because if one nation went to war, others would be pulled in automatically. Nationalism and rising pride. Across Europe, a powerful idea was spreading: nationalism. People felt deep pride in their country. They believed their nation was superior and deserved power and recognition. But nationalism also created tension, especially in regions where different ethnic groups lived together. One of the most unstable regions was the Balkans, often called the powder keg of Europe. The Balkans were a region of conflict. Small nations and competing interests filled the region. Serbia wanted to unite Slavic people. Austria-Hungary wanted to maintain control over the region. Russia supported Serbia, and tensions kept rising. This region had already seen multiple conflicts, and it was here that the spark of World War I would begin. Militarism, preparing for war. At the same time, European nations were building powerful armies. This was known as militarism. Countries believed that strength meant survival. Germany and Britain competed to build stronger navies. France and Russia expanded their armies. War plans were created long before war actually began. Europe was not just preparing for peace, it was preparing for war. The assassination in Sarajevo. On June 28, 1914, everything changed. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary visited the city of Sarajevo. As his car moved through the streets, a young nationalist named Gavrilo Princip stepped forward and fired 2 shots. Within moments, the Archduke and his wife were dead. What seemed like a single act of violence would soon trigger a global war. Austria-Hungary's response. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination. They issued an ultimatum with strict demands. Serbia agreed to most of them, but not all. For Austria-Hungary, this was enough. On July 28, 1914, they declared war on Serbia, and the chain reaction began. The domino effect of alliances. Russia, supporting Serbia, began mobilizing its army. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia. France, allied with Russia, prepared for war. Germany then declared war on France, and when Germany invaded Belgium, Britain declared war on Germany. Within days, Europe was at war. The Schlieffen Plan. Germany had a strategy, a plan to avoid fighting on 2 fronts. It was called the Schlieffen Plan. The idea was simple: quickly defeat France in the west, then turn to face Russia in the east. To do this, German forces moved through Belgium, but this decision would have major consequences. Britain enters the war. Belgium was a neutral country. When Germany invaded it, Britain responded. On August 4, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. Now the conflict was no longer limited. It had become a full-scale European war. Early battles and movement. At first, the war moved quickly. Armies marched across borders. Battles were fought in open fields. Both sides believed the war would be short. Many soldiers thought they would return home by Christmas, but they were wrong. The Battle of the Marne. In September 1914, one of the most important battles took place, the Battle of the Marne. French and British forces stopped the German advance toward Paris. This battle changed everything. Germany failed to achieve a quick victory, and the war began to slow down. The beginning of trench warfare. As both sides tried to defend their positions, they began digging trenches, deep, narrow lines in the ground, stretching for miles from the North Sea to Switzerland. The war had transformed. It was no longer fast and mobile. It became a slow, deadly stalemate. Life in the trenches. For soldiers, life in the trenches was brutal. Mud filled the ground. Rats spread disease. Water collected at their feet, and the constant fear of attack never disappeared. Soldiers lived surrounded by danger, explosions, gunfire, and the uncertainty of survival. This was not the quick war they had expected. This was something far worse. A war that stopped moving. By late 1914, the war had come to a standstill. Neither side could move forward. Both sides were trapped. From the coast of Belgium to the mountains of Switzerland, a long line of trenches divided the battlefield. This was no longer a war of movement. It had become a war of waiting. The structure of the trenches. The trenches were carefully designed. They were not just simple holes in the ground. There were frontline trenches where soldiers faced the enemy, support trenches where supplies were kept, and communication trenches connecting everything together. Barbed wire stretched across the land between enemies, a deadly space known as no man's land. Between the two sides lay a barren, broken stretch of land, filled with craters from artillery, scattered with bodies, and covered in mud. This was no man's land. Crossing it was extremely dangerous. Any soldier who tried to run across it risked being shot immediately. Yet, again and again, soldiers were ordered to charge into it. The reality of daily life. Life in the trenches was exhausting. Soldiers woke before dawn, they stood guard, they repaired damaged walls, and they waited, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. The sound of distant gunfire never stopped, and sleep was never truly peaceful. The enemy you couldn't see. Not all dangers came from the battlefield. Disease spread quickly in the trenches. Poor hygiene, contaminated water, and constant exposure to cold and wet conditions. Many soldiers suffered from infections. Some never even saw combat, yet still lost their lives. Trench foot and survival. One of the most common problems was trench foot. Soldiers stood in wet conditions for long periods. Their feet became swollen, infected, and painful. In severe cases, amputation was required. Simple survival in the trenches became a daily struggle. War was not just about fighting, it was about enduring. The sound of war. The battlefield had its own language. The constant thunder of artillery, the sharp crack of rifles, the distant whistle of incoming shells, and sometimes the sudden silence before an attack. These sounds became part of a soldier's life, and even long after the war ended, many would never forget them. The rise of machine guns. Technology changed the nature of warfare. One of the most devastating weapons was the machine gun. Capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, it made traditional attacks almost impossible. Soldiers charging across no man's land were often cut down within seconds. This weapon alone turned the war into a deadly stalemate. Artillery, the most destructive weapon. But even more deadly than machine guns was artillery. Massive cannons fired shells across long distances. Explosions tore apart the landscape. Entire areas were reduced to rubble. Most casualties in World War I were caused not by bullets, but by artillery. It was the true weapon of destruction. Poison gas, a new kind of horror. In 1915, a terrifying new weapon was introduced: poison gas. Clouds of toxic chemicals drifted across the battlefield, burning lungs, blinding eyes, causing slow, painful deaths. Soldiers were forced to wear gas masks, but even with protection, the fear remained. This was warfare unlike anything seen before. The Battle of Verdun. In 1916, one of the longest and most brutal battles began: the Battle of Verdun. Germany aimed to weaken France by forcing it into a battle of exhaustion. For months, both sides fought relentlessly. Soldiers rotated in and out of the front lines, but the fighting never stopped. Verdun became a symbol of endurance and suffering. They shall not pass. At Verdun, French forces adopted a powerful message: they shall not pass. It became a symbol of resistance. Despite heavy losses, French soldiers held their ground. The battle lasted nearly 10 months, and by the end, hundreds of thousands had died. Yet the front line had barely moved. The Battle of the Somme. While Verdun continued, another massive battle began: the Battle of the Somme. British and French forces launched an attack to break the stalemate. On the first day alone, tens of thousands of soldiers were killed. It remains one of the deadliest days in British military history. A war of attrition. Both sides were now fighting a different kind of war, a war of attrition. The goal was no longer quick victory. It was to wear down the enemy, to exhaust their resources, their soldiers, their will to continue. Victory would come not through speed, but through endurance. The first use of tanks. In 1916, a new machine appeared on the battlefield, the tank. Large, armored, and capable of crossing trenches, it was designed to break through enemy defenses. At first, tanks were slow and unreliable, but they marked the beginning of a new era in warfare, one where machines would play an even greater role. The human cost of war. As the war continued, the numbers began to rise. Thousands became millions. Millions became unimaginable loss. Families across Europe received letters that carried devastating news. Fathers, sons, brothers, gone. World War I was no longer just a war between nations. It had become a human tragedy on a massive scale. Letters from the front. Soldiers often wrote letters home, trying to comfort their families, trying to hide the truth. They spoke of courage, of duty, of hope, but rarely of fear, rarely of the horrors they faced every day, because some experiences were too painful to put into words. The psychological impact. The war didn't just destroy bodies, it affected the mind. Many soldiers suffered from what was then called shell shock. Today, we understand it as trauma. Constant explosions, fear, exhaustion. The human mind was pushed beyond its limits, and many soldiers returned home, changed forever. War in the skies. For the first time in history, war reached the skies. Airplanes were used for reconnaissance, to observe enemy movements, but soon they became weapons. Pilots engaged in aerial combat high above the battlefield. Dogfights, fast, dangerous, and often deadly. The rise of fighter pilots. Fighter pilots became some of the most recognized figures of the war. They were seen as skilled and daring. Among them was the famous Red Baron, a German pilot known for his precision and success in battle. But behind the legend, these pilots faced constant danger. Every flight could be their last. War at sea. The conflict was not limited to land and air. It extended into the oceans. Navies clashed for control of vital trade routes. Britain used its powerful navy to block supplies reaching Germany. This blockade caused severe shortages: food, resources, fuel. The war was now being fought on every front. The threat of submarines. Germany responded with a new weapon, the submarine, or U-boat. These vessels could travel underwater, unseen. They targeted enemy ships carrying supplies, merchant vessels, passenger ships, anything considered part of the enemy effort. The oceans became a dangerous place. The sinking of the Lusitania. In 1915, a passenger ship called the Lusitania was crossing the Atlantic. It carried civilians, including Americans. A German U-boat launched a torpedo. Within minutes, the ship sank. Nearly 1,200 people lost their lives. The world was shocked. and public opinion began to shift. The United States watches. At the beginning of the war, the United States remained neutral. Many Americans believed it was a European conflict, not their war. But events like the sinking of the Lusitania and continued submarine attacks began to change that view. The war was no longer distant, it was becoming personal. The Zimmerman telegram. In 1917, a secret message was intercepted. It was sent by Germany to Mexico. The message suggested that if Mexico joined the war against the United States, Germany would support them. When this message became public, it caused outrage. Now, the United States could no longer remain on the sidelines. America enters the war. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. Fresh troops, new resources, and renewed energy entered the conflict. American soldiers began arriving in Europe. Their presence changed the balance of power and gave new hope to the Allied forces. A global war. World War I was not just fought in Europe, it spread across the world. Battles took place in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Colonies and territories became part of the conflict. Millions of soldiers from different parts of the world were drawn into the war. It truly became a global struggle. The final German offensive. In 1918, Germany made one last attempt to win the war. They launched a massive offensive on the Western Front. At first, they gained ground, pushing back Allied forces, but their resources were running low and their soldiers were exhausted. The offensive could not be sustained. The Allied counterattack. With American support, the Allies launched a powerful counterattack. Fresh troops and coordinated strategy began pushing German forces back. For the first time in years, the stalemate was breaking. Germany was now on the defensive, and the end of the war was approaching. The collapse of the Central Powers. One by one, Germany's allies began to fall. Austria-Hungary weakened. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. Internal problems grew within Germany itself. Protests, shortages, and loss of morale. The Central Powers could no longer continue the fight. The war was coming to its conclusion. Germany on the brink. By late 1918, Germany was exhausted. Years of war had drained its resources. Food shortages spread across the country. Civilians struggled to survive. And on the battlefield, soldiers were tired and losing hope. The empire that once seemed unstoppable was now on the edge of collapse. Internal unrest. Back home, unrest began to grow. Workers went on strike. Citizens protested against the war, and even soldiers began questioning their leaders. The pressure from inside the country was becoming just as dangerous as the enemy outside. Germany was no longer united. The fall of the Kaiser. As the situation worsened, Germany's leader, Kaiser Wilhelm II, lost control. Faced with growing unrest and defeat, he was forced to step down. For the first time in years, Germany no longer had its emperor. The old system had fallen, and a new government took its place. The Armistice. On November 11, 1918, at exactly 11 a.m., the guns fell silent. An agreement known as the Armistice was signed. After more than 4 years of brutal conflict, World War I had finally come to an end. Across the battlefield, soldiers stopped fighting, and for the first time in years, there was silence. The aftermath of war. But the end of fighting did not mean the end of suffering. The war had left behind destruction on a massive scale. Cities were damaged, fields were destroyed, and millions of lives had been lost. Entire generations were affected. The world would never be the same again. The human cost. World War I caused over 16 million deaths. Soldiers, civilians, families. Each number represented a life, a story, a future that would never be lived. It was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, and its impact was felt across the world. The Treaty of Versailles. In 1919, world leaders gathered in France. Their goal was to create peace. The result was the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was forced to accept responsibility for the war. It had to give up land, reduce its military, and pay heavy financial penalties. The treaty was meant to prevent future conflict, but it would have consequences no one fully expected. A harsh peace. For many in Germany, the treaty felt unfair, humiliating, and deeply painful. The country was struggling, its economy was weak, its people were frustrated. Instead of creating lasting peace, the treaty created resentment, and that resentment would grow over time. The collapse of empires. World War I did more than end a conflict. It ended entire empires. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire all collapsed. In their place, new nations were created. The map of Europe changed forever. New nations, new tensions. With new countries came new challenges. Borders were redrawn. Different ethnic groups were placed together, and political tensions remained. The war had ended, but peace was fragile. The world was still unstable. The League of Nations. To prevent another global war, an organization was created, the League of Nations. Its goal was simple: maintain peace, resolve conflicts, and avoid future wars. But without strong support from all major nations, its power was limited. The seeds of another war. While the world hoped for peace, the conditions created after World War I were planting the seeds of another conflict. Economic struggles, political instability, and growing anger. These factors would eventually lead to the rise of new leaders and new ideologies. The world had not yet seen the end of global war. The war that changed everything. World War I changed the way wars were fought. It introduced modern weapons, machine guns, tanks, chemical warfare. It showed the world the true cost of industrialized war, and it forced nations to rethink the future. Remembering the soldiers. Even today, memorials stand across the world, honoring those who served and those who never returned. The stories of these soldiers remind us of the human side of history, their courage, their sacrifice, and the reality of war. The legacy of World War I. World War I was more than a conflict. It was a turning point in history. It reshaped nations, changed societies, and influenced the course of the 20th century. Its lessons remain important even today, because understanding the past helps us better understand the future. The forgotten soldiers. When we think of World War I, we often imagine European battlefields, but millions of soldiers came from far beyond Europe. From India, Africa, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. They fought in a war that was not born in their homeland, yet they became part of its history. Their stories are often overlooked, but their sacrifice was just as real. Life far from home. For many of these soldiers, the war was their first time leaving home. They traveled across oceans, entered unfamiliar lands, and faced conditions they had never experienced before. Different climates, different languages, and the constant presence of danger. War changed their lives forever. The role of women. While men fought on the front lines, women stepped into new roles. They worked in factories, produced weapons, drove ambulances, served as nurses near the battlefield. For many women, this was the first time they had taken on such responsibilities. The war changed not only nations, but also the role of women in society. Nurses on the front lines. Nurses worked close to the front lines. They treated wounded soldiers under difficult conditions. Hospitals were often overcrowded, supplies were limited, and the number of injured never seemed to end. Despite the danger, they continued their work, saving lives one patient at a time. The Spanish flu pandemic. As the war was ending, another disaster began. A deadly virus spread across the world, the Spanish flu. It infected millions and caused even more deaths than the war itself. Weak soldiers returning home helped spread the disease further. The world was facing not just recovery, but another crisis: war and technology. World War I accelerated technological change. Weapons became more advanced, communication improved, transportation evolved. But these advancements came with a cost. Technology made war more efficient and more destructive. The world had entered a new era of warfare. The changing nature of combat. Before World War I, many battles were fought in open fields, with visible lines and movement. But this war changed everything. Combat became hidden, defensive, and heavily dependent on machines. The battlefield became more complex and more deadly. The psychological scars. When soldiers returned home, many carried invisible wounds, memories of explosions, loss, fear. These experiences stayed with them long after the war had ended. The war didn't end in 1918. For many, it continued in their minds. A generation lost. World War I is often described as a war that lost a generation. Young men who should have lived long lives never returned. Entire communities felt the impact. Families changed forever. And the absence of that generation shaped society in the years that followed. Art and expression after the war. After the war, artists, writers, and poets began expressing what they had seen. Their work revealed the reality of war, not glory, not heroism, but suffering, confusion, and loss. Their voices helped the world understand what war truly meant. The memory of the trenches. The trenches became a symbol of World War I, a place of endurance, of fear, of survival. Even today, when we think of this war, we imagine those narrow lines in the ground where soldiers waited, hoped, and fought. Lessons the world tried to learn. After the war, leaders promised that such a conflict would never happen again. They spoke of peace, cooperation, and understanding. But history is complex, and lessons are not always learned quickly. The fragile peace. The years after World War I were not truly peaceful. Economic problems, political instability, and rising tensions remained. The world was trying to rebuild, but the foundation was still weak. The rise of new powers. In the years that followed, new leaders began to rise, promising strength, change, and a better future. But some of these promises would lead the world into even greater conflict. The shadow of another war. The effects of World War I did not end in 1918. They continued, quietly shaping events, influencing decisions, and preparing the world for another global conflict, a Second World War, even more devastating than the first. Why World War I still matters. More than a century later, World War I still matters. It changed borders, nations, and global power. It reshaped how countries interact and how wars are fought. Understanding it helps us understand the modern world. The importance of remembering. History is not just about the past. It is about memory, about learning, and about understanding. Remembering World War I means honoring those who lived through it and those who did not. The human story behind history. Behind every battle, every decision, and every number, there were people, individuals with hopes, fears, and dreams. World War I was not just a historical event, it was a human story. A world forever changed. When the war ended, the world was different. Empires were gone, new nations had formed, and the balance of power had shifted. The 20th century would unfold in ways no one could have predicted. Final reflection. World War I began with a single moment, a single decision, but it grew into something far greater, a global conflict that changed history forever. Its legacy remains, not just in books, but in the world we live in today. And as we look back, we are reminded of one simple truth. History is not just something we study, it is something we must understand.